instead of putting this into education or healthcare. Pakistan was constituted predominantly as a Muslim state and later was also called Islamic Republic Pakistan. But even Pakistan has lost some its non-Muslim and non-Sunni population because these groups very often no longer felt safe there. And the ethnic heterogeneity of the original Pakistan, as we all know, led to the partition into West and East Pakistan, or Pakistan and Bangladesh, quite a few years later. But given the fact that the Indian subcontinent was, or the British India, if you want to put it that way, was not only home to Hindus and Muslims, but also to other religions, it stood to reason that India, sort of with the idea of encompassing the rest, could not really be a Hindu state or a state of any one religion, for the simple reason that you had many religions present. And now only about 4/5 of the population are Hindu, and a large minority, about over 1/8 of the population, are Muslims, and the rest are other religions, Sikhs, Chinese, Christians, Buddhists. So it stood to reason that India could only be a secular state. We heard about secularism before. It would have made no sense to have a Hindu state, and any attempts in that direction, I hope, will lead to nothing, because it can only lead to trouble. Of course, we don't know what was expected at the time of partition. Maybe the idea was that all the Muslims would move to Pakistan. It didn't happen that way, because today India is the country with the third largest Muslim population, so it can only be a secular state. So, when I was invited to talk to you today on 70 years of Indian independence, I was invited for a date in September or October, and so I said, well, what comes to mind is the 21st of October, which would have been a weekend, so we agreed on the 23rd of October. And as Ashish Ray pointed out, that the 21st of October 1943 was the day when the Provisional Indian Exile Government was set up. And in fact, on the 23rd of October 1943, the first cabinet meeting of the exile government was held. On October 21st, Netaji read the declaration proclaiming the exile government, and his idea had actually been a different one. He would have much preferred that a government should be set up by the freedom fighters in India. But as it is said, Gandhi declined. It may also not have been very practical, because I think at that time many of the freedom fighter leadership was in prison. And you might even speculate that maybe such a move within India would have had very little consequence. I think it made a lot of sense for the Indians in Southeast Asia, because they were the people who, from whom the recruits of the Indian National Army came. And for the Indian National Army, it certainly sort of gave them a degree of legitimacy, of position also vis-a-vis the Japanese army, which supported them very strongly. And I want to read to you a few quotes from a book from S.A. Iyer, who was Minister of Propaganda and in the exile government. He wrote a book, Unto Him a Witness, reporting on those days. And I also want to have read a short excerpt from the memoirs of the Rani of Jhansi commander, Lakshmi, then Swaminathan, later Saigal, a revolutionary life. It's not too long, so because I'm just extracting parts of these things. SAIA writes, on 4th of July 1943, Raj Bihari Bose, the veteran Indian revolutionary, handed over, and Subhash Chandra Bose accepted the presidentship of the Indian Independence League in East Asia. Addressing the 5,000 Indians assembled in the hall, it was held in a cinema hall, Subhash created a sensation by his announcement that he was thinking of establishing a provisional government of Free India to lead the Indian National Army to battle against the British forces on Indian soil. From the Japanese point of view, this in the midst of the Second World War, which they were waging at that moment, that was not a self-evident move. And it was also not an easy one, and I think this we have to keep in mind because Netaji had tried very hard to get the German and the Italian governments to commit themselves to a so-called India resolution stating that they would fully support Indian independence, and Germany and Italy refused to do that. It was really Germany that refused, Italy sort of followed along. So it was not such a matter-of-fact thing for Japan to do that, but possibly it was more important to have the Japanese government go along with that. Because first of all, it involved the recognition of the provisional government of Free India on the part of Japan. Second, Japan also had to try to convince the allied powers of Japan, which was Germany, Italy, Croatia, Burma, Thailand, China, the Philippines, and Manchukuo, that they would recognize the free government of India. It also involved other aspects, the facilities of diplomatic privileges due to an independent nation. For example, it would involve that the president of the exiled government could also go and meet the emperor of Japan and things like that. Then the INA had to be treated at another footing than if there had been no exile government. So it was certainly not an easy move for the Japanese side either. And SAIA continues to write, I have no doubt that Netaji had told Tojo soon after he reached Tokyo from Berlin in June of his intention to form a provisional government, and he must have received a general assurance of support from him. Otherwise, this certainly could not have been done. It was a bit more difficult for the liaison office of the Japanese to the INA, the Hikari Kikan, because they had not been told before, and they were sort of surprised to hear this all of a sudden, and couldn't believe that their government would go along with that. SAIA writes, the Japanese were not very keen on the provisional government of Masatin being a full-fledged government, expecting recognition by the Axis and their allies. But ultimately the Japanese had to give way. Only 3 days before the historic day of the 21st of October, Netaji sent for a senior officer of the Kikan and told him confidentially that he intended to proclaim the formation of the provisional government of Azad Hind on the 21st. And Lakshmi Sehgal writes about the same thing. Netaji was holding innumerable conferences around that time with army chiefs, the Indian Independence League heads of department, particularly with S.A. Iyer, and occasionally with the Japanese. On October 19th, I learned what that decision was. I was sent for by Netaji and informed that he intended proclaiming a provisional government of Free India on October 21st. He asked me if I would be willing to join the cabinet as minister in charge of women's affairs, and you have to consider that. That was 1943. There are some countries who don't have a ministry of women affairs or don't bother about that very much. I mean, if you think of a country like Saudi Arabia, which has made the great advance of allowing women to drive, this was quite outstanding at the time. He informed us that he had hoped the Indian National Congress would declare independence on their own and form a parallel government which would force the British to abdicate power, but Gandhiji had vetoed the idea. On October 21st at 2 p.m., at a very solemn ceremony in the same Katai hall that had witnessed his arrival on 4th of July, Netaji declared the formation of the provisional government of Azad Hind. Netaji, with tears in his eyes, took the oath in the name of God and his 400 million countrymen. And as I pointed out before, on the night of the 23rd, Netaji called his first cabinet meeting. I will skip over the text of the Proclamation of Independence, of which I had in an excerpt, and continue with my own comments on these things. You may feel that this move was of little consequence for the future development of the Indian independence movement, in view of the fact that Germany, as I pointed out, Germany had refused an India resolution, but for Japan this was somewhat difficult as well. But on a more personal note, I would also point out that given the fact that Netaji did not live to August 14 and 15, 1947, the establishment of a provisional government and the cession of the first free territory of India on November 6th, Andaman Nicobar Islands, ex post facto turned out to be a momentous move for him personally. Success has many fathers and many mothers. In that sense, there exist different claims to what and who is to be credited with India's finally gaining independence. One myth is the transfer of power, the British myth. In August 1947, supposedly, according to that myth, power was transferred to India and Pakistan voluntarily. And the idea was, by people who sort of followed that myth, that this was sort of a further step in previous developments, previously already in the 30s and before, a degree of self-administration and self-rule had been conveyed on India, in the sense that you had provincial governments and you had municipalities run by Indian mayors. Netaji had also been mayor of Calcutta. Then there's another myth, which is the long upheld myth by the Indian side, that only the civil disobedience movement is responsible for gaining independence. Ashish Ray already pointed out what role the INA trials had in India's independence, and later documents also prove that it was not only the civil obedience movement which convinced the British that they could not hold on to India any longer, but it was also the effect of the propaganda which unintentionally the British made for the independence movement when they reported about the trials. They had expected that these officers would be considered traitors, but they were considered heroes. And after this, the British could no longer be certain that they could depend on the army and on the navy in India to suppress the system. Because after all, that was the Indian soldiers themselves were the strong arm of sort of upholding the British rule at the time. Ashish Ray already spoke about the role Prem Segal, Shahnawaz Khan and Dylan had in that, and of these three, I knew Dylan and Mrs. Segal, Lakshmi Swaminathan earlier, the best, and we talked about that once, what it also meant sort of to be a legend in his own time. Because in a way, in the beginning, this was probably a very uplifting experience for these three men, because they're a symbol of the freedom movement at the time. But it was also a very difficult one, and if you look at the consequences later on, it may have been even more difficult. For example, Prem Segal had been an officer in the British Indian Army before, and when India became independent and it turned out that the INA officers and soldiers would not be taken into the Indian Army, it must have been a very grave disappointment. Incidentally, I think in Pakistan they were taken into the army. Sorry, I'm somehow making a lot of background noise. But since I was asked to speak about the anniversary of independence, I also consider it my duty, and not only towards my father, but also towards the veterans of the Indian National Army, to remind you of their contribution as well. This is more so the case because I feel that particularly India was unwilling to convey such a recognition to them for much too long a time. I mentioned the not accepting them into the Indian Army. There is the British Indian Army soldiers who, as I just pointed out, were the tool to suppress India, became the new Indian Army of Free India. But even the recognition as freedom fighters for the members of the Indian National Army took a long time. It took until 1979, when there was a Janata government, not a Congress government, to be recognized as freedom fighters. And that had certain practical implications because there were some benefits attached to it. And if you think of it, I don't want to play down the role that other freedom fighters had in independence, but I would say a soldier risks more, particularly more directly his own life, or her own life, because India had a women's corps as well. And they were not recognized as freedom fighters. Not even talking about those, hopefully few individuals who always sort of end up on top, who had been suppressing their fellow Indians before and did so after independence as well, because all of a sudden they claimed to have been all in favor of independence. But it was rather outrageous how they were treated and how they were not recognized. But let me turn to the events of August 1947. At the eve of independence, the new Indian Prime Minister Nehru delivered his famous speech, A Tryst with Destiny, and I want to quote from that. The future is not one of ease or resting, but incessant striving, so that we might fulfill the pledge we have so often taken, and the one we shall take today. The service of India means the service of millions who suffer. It means ending poverty and ignorance, and it means equality of opportunity. 70 years later, what has happened? It seems the words of the first Prime Minister of India, of Free India I should say, should be and have to be as relevant today for any man or any woman who take higher office for their country. But we have to realize today that economic and social development is a far more long drawn out process than maybe one thought at that time. These small or seemingly small steps are even more difficult to reach than the seemingly big step of getting political independence and sovereignty. And I just want to quote another example from the country which has become my home, Germany. When Germany reunited in 1990, the two former German states, East and West Germany, became one state again, or East Germany joined the West German state. Everyone was very enthusiastic and thought, well, there was a German Wirtschaftswunder, an economic miracle after the Second World War. Growth rates were up, and it didn't take the country that long to sort of become economically successful. Self-sustaining growth should be achieved in East Germany just as well. I mean, they are qualified workers, it's the same language, it's essentially the same culture. And when some of us said at the time, many of us were involved in studying this transition process, that well, it will take at least 10 years till East Germany comes up to the standard of West Germany. Somehow said nonsensical. And of course the Chancellor of Unification, Helmut Kohl, said, soon there will be blooming landscapes in this country and nobody will be worse off and many will be better off. It's 27 years after unification, and I think the income level of East Germany is at about 75% or something of that in West Germany. Unemployment rate is much higher. There has been a de-industrialization, which had its reason, but I won't go into that. What I want to point out is, in a way, this was a social experiment, if you want to say so. You had the same people, the same language, the same educational system, essentially, till about 1945. You had the same bad experience of World War II also until 1945, the Nazi regime from 1933 onwards. You would imagine that from 1945 to 1990 isn't that long to sort of totally drift apart, that these two systems should integrate very easily. But what this showed, in my opinion, is that somehow structures are far more difficult to change. You cannot change them in the short run with just turning a switch. And even in that relatively short time, starting from the same beginning, so to say, the minds had also somewhat drifted apart. And today people say sometimes, well, the wall in Berlin has been pulled down, but the wall in the heads of the people is still there. So what do we expect to achieve in a process like in India at that time? Was it realistic that India, just by attaining political independence, would come anywhere up to par economically with more advanced countries? I think if we had looked for that today from other experiences, we can see that this was a totally unrealistic expectation. After India became politically independent, a relatively long period of political stability ensued, much more so in India than in Pakistan. And India prides herself today as the world's largest economy. The largest democracy, not yet the largest economy. While democracy may mean many things and has many different facets, India certainly has fulfilled one which I consider of eminent importance. India has shown and accepted that governments can change as the outcome of elections, and they are accepted. And I think in that sense, Indira Gandhi had a very important contribution to make to India, many others too, but one very important, when she was defeated in the election, which she had not expected at the time. She accepted the defeat and did not try a coup d'etat to undo that. I don't know whether a coup d'etat might have been successful or not, maybe not, because her emergency rule had not been very popular. But I think she set a precedence which was never called into question after that, to my knowledge. Of course, there are other aspects which may not always be fulfilled. Fair elections without rigging, due process of law, lack of corruption, formally and actually equal rights and opportunities for men and women, for different ethnic groups, different religious groups, and minorities in general. But the shortcomings in democracy in that sense, in all fairness, are not confined to India or to the Indian subcontinent. Now, has India lived up to the expectations Netaji had? We can only speculate on that. While Netaji in his speeches and writings dealt with a variety of details in various policy fields, essentially you have to take into consideration that these ideas were drawn up in the 1930s and the 1940s. The 1940s were war years, so they were not only unusual for the combatants but also for the civilian population. And unless we feel that a war and military conflicts are normal, we have to consider that these unusual circumstances sort of also give a different aspect on what we expect that will happen. As a socialist thinker, Netaji, like Nehru, had ideas which referred to a development after independence. The byproduct of existing socialist or communist economies, administrative inefficiencies, lack of flexibility, lack of incentive systems, obstacles to innovation, which eventually led to the breakdown of the communist economies, were not evident at the time. Thus, it was not surprising that, say, in the 1930s, Netaji, like other left thinkers of those days, put far more trust in the state-controlled and state-run enterprises. Some have charged Netaji of being too impressed by the autocratic systems of Germany and Japan that they had during the Second World War. It is true that German efficiency and order impressed him favorably, reliability, punctuality, dependability. However, it seems that he was far too aware of India's diversity in religions, languages, and culture to envisage the same thing for a free India. In his presidential address in 1938, for example, he talks of the goals of unity as well as the respect for diversity. Our goal is that of an independent India, and in my view, that goal can be attained only through a federal republic in which the provinces and states will be willing partners, unquote.